both of you for joining us. And welcome everybody else joining us to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar. These are sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Our website is tah.org, and it's the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics, with a lot of resources for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett, teach political science at Ashland University, and along with one of my guests today, John Moser, and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. So as you know, we are doing a series of webinars this year called Moments of Crisis, and in case you happen to be joining us for the first time, just so you know, the purpose of these is to look at a particularly important historical moment and pull together some thoughtful, interesting persons, some scholars to help us think these things through. And we're very fortunate today to have two very thoughtful scholars joining us, Will Addo of the University of Dallas, and John Moser, as I mentioned, my colleague here at Ashland University and co-chair of the master's program. Thanks to both of you for joining us this morning.
Nice to be here.
Good,
Thanks.
glad to do it. John, you've been here before. As I mentioned, John's the co-chair of the master's program. Will teaches in our master's program and has been teaching with us for quite a long time. So it's great to see you both. So I love this topic because I love talking about especially Cold War strategy. So I'm hoping that one thing you'll both be able to help us do today, nice coffee mug, John. Nice plug. One thing you'll both be able to.
Want to see that?
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So one thing you'll be able to help us, both of you help us think through is sort of big terms. How does this event, the Cuban Missile Crisis, how does this come about as a result of U.S. and Soviet strategy, and how does it affect U.S. and Soviet strategy afterward? I'm hoping we'll spend some time thinking that through. But maybe to start with, I mean, most of us know, the sort of basics of this. It's a 13-day crisis, essentially, in October of '62. Maybe one or both of you could start us thinking about how did this escalate to the point that we're on the verge of, actually shooting at each other? Can you sort of walk us through the escalation up to this point, and then we'll kind of see where you can take it any direction you want from there. John,
You want to start?
Sure, John, absolutely. And then I'll try to be brief here, and then if people want to add to that, or John, if you want to add, obviously feel free. So I'll say, Chris, as you mentioned there, in mid-October, we get the first of the U-2 reconnaissance imagery there that shows most definitely that there's the construction of these intermediate range, medium and intermediate range missile sites, and of course then that forces quite quickly a decision on Kennedy's part and the Kennedy administration. That's one of the things I always try to stress with students is how little time there is in some sense to come to grips with this situation. I think that's one of the things with respect to your question about how does it escalate as quickly as it does. There was a formula that was published, a formula of sorts. I think it was in Newsweek, in the weeks or months prior to this event, and that was that I think the acronym was for middle range ballistic missiles. If you coupled that with Cuba, then it equaled ICBMs, which was, of course, the notion that if the Soviets ever installed nuclear weapons in Cuba, then they actually now finally had something they didn't have before, and that was an intercontinental delivery system. So you have to, if you're the Kennedy administration, you can't, and we can go into the particulars in terms of where the intelligence is at any given time. Do we know for sure how many missiles are there, or are they already coupled with warheads and things of that nature? But the fact is that you don't have all that information at the time. And Kennedy, of course, has to act in part upon obviously the best intelligence available in that respect. And so you have to deliver an ultimatum of sorts here in the short run, because if you allow them to actually couple warheads and missiles, then you have this fait accompli, and you have a completely different situation. If in fact that happens. I mean, we know now that there was proximity between the warheads and the missiles, but they weren't mounted. They weren't joined in that sense. But again, Kennedy doesn't know that. So that's why I think in part this really quick action, this sort of rapid escalation of things, because simply there's just not time to. I mean, if they get even these short range or medium range ballistic missiles operative, then you're talking about reaching as far north as Washington, D.C. and as far west, and I guess I'm especially sensitive to this fact, as far west as Dallas, Texas. So, that's quite a swath that is going to be accessible immediately.
That's a great point. So just for clarification, both the missiles and the warheads we did know were in Cuba. Is that right? They just weren't.
Again, there's speculation about the number, the strength of them. There's no doubt about the missiles, in other words, the delivery system. And then there's no doubt about the fact that there's an installation or facilities that are indicative of what the Soviets would have constructed to house, to contain the warheads that they would then, would subsequently, put on those missiles once they had them fully operative.
Okay. Was there some, I mean, were we absolutely certain that the warheads were there? I guess I've always thought maybe one of the purposes of the blockade was just in case the warheads weren't there, that we were trying to prevent the Soviets from actually bringing those, so they then could finish putting together their delivery systems. But
yeah, that's true. And again, as I say, with respect, I mean, there's no question about where they're headed. I mean, where the Soviets are headed and the Cubans, what they have in place in terms of, the apparatus necessary for the missile sites themselves. And then the equipment, the holding facilities, that type of thing necessary for the warheads. But you have to work upon, some speculation in terms of whether or not the warheads are actually there or not.
Right.
Turns out, of course, that there were, but when this thing unfolds immediately in mid-October, that isn't known with certainty.
So they kind of have to work on the assumption that they are, even if they're not 100%. I see. Yeah, makes sense.
That's right. And of course, you can't afford not to,
right.
in that kind of situation.
So John, please elaborate on any of this if you like.
Sure.
Will raises a number of interesting points as well, and maybe you can.
Yeah, I think it's important that we keep in mind exactly what kind of a crisis we're talking about here. One of the reasons why this episode is so heavily studied by historians and political scientists is because there is such a huge wealth of documents on all sides, and it's in a rather candid moment in one of the meetings of Kennedy's ex-com, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara basically says, from a strategic point of view, these missiles don't really make a difference. We already have, both sides already have the means to destroy one another. The fact that there are missiles in Cuba now means, yeah, some could get here faster, and there's an added danger if Cuba is given tactical control over these missiles, which we know now is something Khrushchev was not willing to let Castro have. But the sense I get from reading the minutes of the ex-com meetings is that Kennedy and his close advisors regarded this as mainly a political crisis and a matter of prestige. It was political in the sense that Cuba had been a big deal in American politics ever since 1960 when Fidel Castro took over. In fact, it had helped build Kennedy's campaign message in the election that year that The Republicans had kind of been asleep at the switch and allowed communism to expand even into the Western Hemisphere. So in a sense, Kennedy had to take a hard line wherever Cuba was concerned. Secondly, he had given a speech. It wasn't even so much a speech. He had issued an announcement in September of 1962, just a month before this, that said, guess what, guys? We know, this was directed toward the Cuban government and to the Soviets. We know that there are Soviet advisors and technicians in Cuba. We know that there are anti-aircraft installations being put up in Cuba. We're not going to do anything about that. But if there should come a time when there are actual Soviet combat troops or Soviet offensive weapons like medium-range ballistic missiles put up in Cuba, that this would be a big problem from where the U.S. was concerned. Once he'd made that statement, it really became necessary from Kennedy's point of view to react harshly, because after all, he had put his own personal prestige on the line. And of course, if it became public knowledge that these missiles were there and the administration didn't do anything about it, the Republicans would have had a field day. And it's very important to understand that as this was going on, midterm elections in 1962 were just a couple of weeks away. Kennedy, in fact, was on the campaign trail for Democratic candidates as this whole thing was going on, and no whisper of this came out until he made his personal announcement on television.
John, if I could add real quickly there, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but kind of following along the lines of what you're talking about, there was, if I'm not mistaken, a Republican senator, I think it was Keating, who basically said, look, they're there already. I mean, and Kennedy essentially said, look, if it proves to be correct, then we're going to be in, and he was talking, as you say, in the political context, we're going to be in huge trouble here.
Right.
And of course, as it turns out, Keating was on to something, as they say.
Yeah. That's right. Keating was talking about this, but there wasn't a sense of national crisis about it until Kennedy made his announcement.
Right.
I see. That's really fascinating, the role that politics plays in this, John, you mentioned in a way Kennedy had to save face here. I mean, really, that's kind of what, in a way, that influenced his decision ultimately to take a hard stand on it in light of the speech that you mentioned. And that reminds me, I don't want to shift gears too much here necessarily, but it reminds me of the importance of face saving in general when it comes to, the strategies between the United States and the Soviets. And I'm calls to my mind even Kennan's long telegram, John, which I know you've taught a lot and written about. And Kennan mentions that on the side of the Soviets, the way they operate, his understanding of Soviet behavior is that a lot of times they'll be aggressive, but if you give them a face-saving option, a lot of times you can find an out to a particular solution. Did Kennedy and others, did they consider? As they were, let me be clear here for a minute. We've got these great documents that you guys, I think, have recommended, showing the deliberations and the meetings and these other sorts of things. Did they consider, short of a blockade, and of course at one point or several points in these debates they were actually talking about airstrikes, but did they consider other means by which they could give Khrushchev a sort of out? In which everybody could kind of save face without coming to this?
There was talk early on. I mean, the assumption on the part of the administration was that Khrushchev was looking to get concessions elsewhere, probably Berlin, but also a big bone of contention were the Jupiter missiles that had only recently been stationed in Turkey, and something, often Khrushchev is portrayed as really doing this as revenge. Right? You're going to put these missiles so close to us. You're going to put your missiles so close to us. We're going to put some close to you. The problem with offering that early on was that the administration, in a sense, really wanted to punish Khrushchev for going beyond. The rules of the Cold War had sort of developed by this time. And Khrushchev was now posing a direct challenge 90 miles from the United States. It wasn't good enough to say, okay, what's it going to take to get you to remove it? Now, we know in the end, Kennedy was willing to pull the missiles out of Turkey, and he would do that not long after this was taken care of. But he always wanted to be careful to prevent this from appearing as a quid pro quo.
That's fascinating. So I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. So in a sense, again, not to say this is the single deciding factor, but the tough stand that we chose to take was meant to send a message to Khrushchev that you've kind of crossed the line here, right? You kind of broke the code, as you put it. That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it that way. I forgot to mention earlier that we encourage others joining us to submit questions in the chat box, and several actually have, and we've got some good questions coming in already. And along the lines of what you were just discussing, John, John is just wondering about the Bay of Pigs. He's asking, did the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis have an impact upon Castro? But can we first address the influence of Bay of Pigs in these unfolding events as well?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with respect to the Bay of Pigs, there's I think in large measure, kind of mistaken notion about how the Soviets and Khrushchev in particular interpreted that event. I mean, it's usually looked upon as, well, if you put it in, you sort of couple it, the Bay of Pigs, the whole business of the Vienna meeting, the Berlin Wall, all those kinds of things, that Khrushchev looks at those in essence as kind of indicative of Kennedy's weakness. And the reality is that even though the Bay of Pigs was a fiasco, of course, from a military standpoint, I mean, it was a debacle. It nonetheless, and again, I think this has come much more to light, say, since 1990, I suppose, for obvious reasons in terms of the documentation that's available. But Khrushchev interpreted that as part of a kind of aggressiveness on the part of Kennedy. And, if you look at things subsequent to that, there's Operation Mongoose and this ongoing attempt to get at Castro, then it sort of puts a very different gloss on this whole idea that that it was all sort of brought on by Kennedy's weakness in terms of Khrushchev's understanding of it. In fact, the reverse is essentially true. And John Lewis Gaddis makes some sort of interesting observation, I think, in this respect, and that is that his argument anyway, and for my money, I think it's a pretty convincing one, is that Khrushchev's first goal here in the sort of post-Bay of Pigs atmosphere was to save the Cuban Revolution. That was his number one priority. And that, the whole, we're going to redress the balance of power issue and those kinds of things was not, completely unimportant, but that it was secondary to that primary goal. Whereas Castro's interpretation of things was kind of just turning that on its head, that he saw this as sort of necessary, as he put it, a point of honor that they would allow Cuba to be turned in effectively to a Soviet missile base, which in essence they didn't really want to do, but that it was necessary in some sense to be, a participant, right, in the overall sort of Marxist-Leninist scheme of things, if I could put it that way, and that, if we're beneficiaries by way of, sort of Soviet protection, that's well and good, but that's not our principal purpose in this. So that kind of runs counter, I think, a lot to what you typically see. I mean, if you pick up most university level textbooks, that's really not generally, I think, the way this is presented. It's usually the former and not the latter so much.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I was also going to ask you both, what did Khrushchev hope to gain from this? I mean, in terms of short term, we've talked a little bit, but big, sort of long term, larger, in terms of larger strategy, long term strategy. What did Khrushchev's stand to gain from this, and how did he think it would affect the sort of future balance of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States? And I hadn't thought of that aspect of it, Will, that in a certain sense, Khrushchev is acting to preserve part of the world sort of communist movement, right, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, he believed it was very necessary for Cuba, if the revolution in Cuba were to be saved, in essence, then this is what was ultimately, necessitated, because, they were going to get at, that is, the Americans, the CIA, they were going to get at Castro. They continued with their sort of plotting, and, there were going to be future assassination attempts, and there were, and that kind of thing was not going to abate any without this kind of, strong showing ultimately on the part of the Soviets. So it really, I mean, the irony there is so thick in some respects, as far as again, Gaddis said, look, both these guys were too polite to actually drill down enough in the other's opinion and their own to have a candid enough conversation to realize that what each thought the other's principal objective was in fact not really the case. They just never got to that point in some sense. Khrushchev, well, I got to do this. I'm gonna do this for Castro. Castro said he had a special fondness for Cuba, and then on the flip side of it, Castro's estimation of this was, this is probably not the most eloquent way of putting it, but we're going to be a good team player here. So you want to do this, and so we're going to acquiesce in some sense in it.
Yeah, it's important to note that Khrushchev's entire foreign policy, or virtually all of it, was based on the idea of supporting quote-unquote wars of national liberation. And this was a departure from Stalin, who honestly didn't care much about the rest of the world. He was focused on Europe and East Asia, I suppose. He was nice that so he was interested in Korea, obviously, but Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Stalin had no real interest in that. It was Khrushchev who really started the Soviet Union on a path of trying to win over what was being called the Third World. And so Cuba was his best example of this strategy bearing fruit, and he wasn't about to see it be taken away from him.
That's fascinating, because it reminds me, John, that in a certain sense, Khrushchev's overall strategy of supporting and spreading communism and supporting other communist nations is in many ways just sort of the same, although the other side of the coin of the Kennedy administration's flexible response strategy. Is that what it was called? Flexible response?
That's right.
Absolutely.
Where on the other, Kennedy had pledged, as you mentioned earlier, John, in various speeches, pledged to support every democratic nation in the world against the threat of communism, essentially anytime, anywhere, and so on and so forth, using any means. There's a lot of rhetoric in that, of course, right? But is you either of you or both of you think that attitude of Kennedy's administration of flexible response in any way made Khrushchev a little more aggressive, particularly in the Western Hemisphere? That's not a good question. Just skip it and say.
No, I hadn't really thought about that. To what extent was Khrushchev responding to the difference between Eisenhower and Kennedy? Because Kennedy had really represented, in a way, a reinvigoration of the Cold War. Just the whole tone of his campaign, as I mentioned before, was that Eisenhower, Grandpa playing golf, was asleep at the switch. We know today that how much that was flatly wrong. A lot of campaign rhetoric in the 1960s had to do with the so-called missile gap, that the Soviets had a significant advantage when it came to missiles. Again, it was complete garbage at the time, and so it has to be, everything Kennedy was doing has to be understood in the light of how he built up the Soviet threat during his own campaign, and how he built up the idea that Cuba, the addition of Cuba to the Soviet bloc, fundamentally changed the nature of the balance of power.
That's a great point. By the way, you mentioned the missile gap, and sorry, images of Dr. Strangelove flashed in my head. But sorry,
Yeah.
great stuff. We cannot allow a missile gap. That's amazing, by the way, how that caught on.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
Kennedy.
Chris, if I could just add in one thing real quick
Yeah,
here, in addition to what John said, just
yeah.
in terms of the falsity of that missile gap. It's so, as I mean, I think John described it well when he said just garbage. It couldn't have been. I mean, the disparity was in 1962 something like 17-1 in terms of strategic capabilities. So it wasn't really even close, in that respect. So sometimes, it's posited in those terms. I think, again, falsely so. It's not always presented up front and clearly just how huge this disparity was.
At the same time, the Kennedy campaign played up the idea that Eisenhower paid too much attention to nuclear weapons and had allowed the conventional forces to languish. A famous book that came out during the campaign was from General Maxwell Taylor called "An Uncertain Trumpet," that really lambasted the Eisenhower administration for reducing the size of the size of the traditional armed forces, and saying that, by the way, it's also Taylor who championed flexible response, and he became one of Kennedy's closest advisors, and in fact, anyone who looked at those documents probably saw Maxwell Taylor's name, because he was deeply involved in these discussions of what to do about the Soviet missiles in Cuba, and he was consistently arguing for airstrike, if not even more warlike response, up to and including invasion of the island.
Yeah, ground force invasion after an airstrike. Yeah, that really struck me. Just how forcefully and consistently he made that argument. So this is great stuff. So then, in terms of what Khrushchev hoped to accomplish here, just to kind of follow up on this, so prop up the communist regime that is still relatively young in Cuba. Did Khrushchev go into this with the objective of getting Kennedy to withdraw U.S. missiles from Turkey and Eastern Europe, or was that something of an afterthought? Because as you mentioned earlier, John, we know Kennedy was willing to do that after this crisis, and may have
as Will pointed out, that was what the Kennedy administration thought that Khrushchev wanted.
Okay.
Which is why the discussion even came up. And Khrushchev, looking for an opportunity to save face when it looked like the whole thing was blowing up in his face, threw that demand in there. But ultimately, I think Will is right to say that what Khrushchev really wants is to protect its satellite state. And obviously, Khrushchev's hope was the whole thing could be set up, right? The missiles could be put into place, and the United States would be faced with a fait accompli. There was nothing that could be done short of launching an attack to destroy the missiles, and the assumption was that would have ushered in World War III.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add there, Chris, with respect to Khrushchev on the whole business of the missiles in Turkey, and those things are pointed, at Russia. His specific comment on this, in the process, both prior to and then once the sites were under construction, that type of thing, was, I'm going to give them a taste of their own medicine, in essence. His reference was to particularly the missiles in Turkey, as he evidently was fond of pointing out to people when he took them to the Black Sea. Look over there. What do you see? And this is what I see. And then and Khrushchev's response always was, well, I'll tell you what I see. I see missiles pointed at my Dhaka.
Right.
So did he think he was going to get them to remove them? By virtue of what he was doing in Cuba? Well, I think whether he did or not, and I don't mean to ride the fence on this too much, whether he did or not, it's actually, I think, a not maybe well-known enough part of the meetings in the Kennedy administration, the extent to which that was out on the table or even put out on the table was a possible outcome. And of course, as we know, ultimately, it was. There's pretty solid evidence, and I think some of this works itself out. John probably knows much more about this in terms of the particulars of the documentation of the meetings with Kennedy and the fact that those XCOM meetings were secretly recorded by him. But he was the one who spoke of compromise. I mean, he was the one who ultimately, despite all the kind of John Kennedy as hawkish on all of this, he was the one who spoke, if you really sift through it at the end of the day, much more about compromise. And there's even, again, I think, pretty clear evidence that he was willing to withdraw those missiles from Turkey, pursuant to an agreement, pursuant to a compromise, if it could be done sort of out of the context, out of the immediate context of what was going on in Cuba. That this is certainly a possibility down the line. Whether that was, a matter of months or something, so that it was sort of be a little bit, of a, not coupled with, if I could put it that way, the crisis in Cuba. But it's sort of, and there's also some suggestion, again, I mentioned John Lewis Gaddis on this. Gaddis suggested even a possibility of, on Kennedy's part, of a so-called Turkish-Cuban missile swap or exchange, which basically meant you get yours out, we get ours out, and that would be not necessarily the deal in its entirety, but at least a critical part of it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Again, and it reminds me again of the importance on both sides at this time of not losing face in a way, right? Again, not just personally, but the whole idea that the United States can't lose face in these situations, and nor can the Soviet Union. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And John, unless you wanted to jump in on this and add anything, I was going to ask about those meetings, and in particular about the people that Kennedy surrounded himself, who had a hand in dealing with this crisis. And John, you mentioned Taylor, and we know Robert Kennedy was part of that. There were some interesting characters around that were part of these meetings and deliberations.
Kennedy said that he liked to rely on what he called action intellectuals.
Oh boy!
So they were or the best and the brightest, right? These were all highly educated men, but they weren't from the ivory tower. McNamara famously turned around General Motors. He'd been a huge asset to General Motors. Maxwell Taylor had been very important in his own right. He was first became known as commander of the 82nd or the 101st Airborne, one of the two airborne U.S. airborne divisions in World War II that was so highly decorated. But of course this meant these were also men of extremely strong opinions and disagreed on a great deal of things. So it almost puts one in mind of the probably not to the same extent as Lincoln's famous team of rivals, but I think this group was probably more unified on essential things than Lincoln's group, but still I think the comparison is apt anyway.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So some of the other figures involved, wasn't Walter Lippmann involved in this to a certain extent, or am I misremembering this?
He was still a very influential columnist at this point.
Maybe I'm drawing this from I think I'm maybe actually drawing this from a scene or a mention of Lippmann in the movie, 13 Days. So maybe you didn't play as much of a role as I thought.
Yeah.
So in these deliberations, in these meetings, I mean, you mentioned Maxwell Taylor is consistently calling for airstrikes and even possibly followed up with ground force invasions. Were there how divided were these action intellectuals, or the best and the brightest? What was the range of options that they were throwing out there, and kind of how did they align themselves? Can we talk about that at all? Do either of you know?
Will, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, well, there was and pardon me, this kind of comes through, of course, in terms of the second of the three documents that we have there. McCone and Maxwell Taylor, Dean Acheson are much more sort of proactive folks in terms of we should consider surgical airstrike first, and then if necessary followed up. And I think there some variations on this as they expressed it, but then make ready for simultaneously make ready for the necessity of a ground campaign against Cuba, whereas principally on the other side, although not exclusively. And I noticed one of the questions here earlier was asking about the Attorney General. Of course, Robert Kennedy was not in favor of an airstrike, which he thought would be unnecessary, sort of unnecessarily aggressive by his own accord, and that a quarantine, if you will. I just call it a blockade, but that's what it is. But that would have been preferable ultimately to that. So there was this divide there, and that's why I mentioned the extent to which, and I'll confess, I would really have to drill down a little bit deeper to kind of come to a solid conclusion if this contention is correct, and that is that Kennedy utilized these meetings with the National Security Council, and particularly with the XCOM, to help achieve a kind of consensus, but not necessarily to change his point of view as to what it was that needed to be done at the end of the day in the first place. Again, that was the subterfuge ultimately, or at least it was secretive, right? It was clear. Those guys don't know they're being recorded here. It sort of begs a little bit of a question when you look at it kind of in toto, and you look at Robert Kennedy's positions on this and the extent to which that clearly figured into the decision the administration ultimately made. That I'm not necessarily prepared to say it was just simply you're going to rubber stamp what Kennedy's arguing for. I mean, I think he's listening to these folks seriously, but I also think at the same time that the sort of compromised nature of his position was fairly well set. He certainly wasn't going to be any Curtis LeMay, let's go do it now, any of this kind of stuff. Not a chance.
Yeah, if you look at the documents over the period where this is being discussed, the first XCOM meetings, you see almost a consensus in favor of military action, of airstrikes, and then one almost gets the sense from looking at that after reflection, some of them start backing away from it and realizing that this runs the risk of a nuclear war, certainly, and then of course you've got the famous conclusion by Bobby Kennedy that I didn't want my brother to be another Tojo, right? We don't do sneak attacks. Yeah. It's not in the American character. Right. So yeah, there is almost a sense of sobering up as they consider the various options. So yeah, blockade, but at the same time, virtually nobody, certainly nobody is saying, what the heck, just leave them there. almost nobody was saying, you know what, we should just open negotiations and try to find a diplomatic solution to this. So the consensus was pretty much these options were too soft, right? The classic Goldilocks situation. The airstrike is too much. Diplomatic option is not enough. There's really only one option left. The only question is, what do you call it, right? Blockade, that's an act of war.
Right.
So that runs certain risks. So we'll do the same thing, but we're going to call it a quarantine instead of a blockade, and it sounds better.
That's a great point. And that reminds me too. Then, so in light, well, it makes me think in light of what you're suggesting, John, the choice to go with the quarantine, as they call it, does that also have the effect? I mean, because that, look, they're drawing a line in the sea, and essentially telling the Soviets you will not pass, but even that could lead to a shooting war, right? What happens if the Soviets do that?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. If the ships, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, does that if the Soviets were to pass that line and it does lead to shooting, does that somehow shift the responsibility for events back on the Soviet Union? If that's if a quarantine is not an act of war by the United States.
It's interesting because it's sort of the reverse situation from the Berlin blockade of the late 1940s. If we put so at that point, at that time, some were saying, all right, let's get a heavily armored train to punch its way through the blockade, and the conclusion was that sounds aggressive.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we fly unarmed transport planes to West Berlin, if those get shot down, then the onus is on the Soviets. They will have fired the first shot.
Yeah.
So the reverse situation prevailed in 1962. If those Soviet ships approach the blockade line, it's the U.S. Navy that's going to be in a position of firing. So yeah, the most dangerous days of the crisis are what follows the announcement of the quarantine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to add there, if you consider the military situation as far as the military reality in the Western Hemisphere, Soviets on one hand, the United States on the other, and you think about it from Khrushchev's point of view in terms of what the real, the military situation is. And I don't care whether you're looking at nuclear or conventional, but for the moment, I'll just stick with a conventional kind of comparison. There really isn't any comparison, as far as military events in Cuba would be concerned. If it comes down to the use of conventional military forces, then the Soviets, Khrushchev is at more than a little bit of a disadvantage. They don't have anything even remotely approaching, the ability to bring conventional forces to bear that the United States does at this point. Khrushchev had talked to Castro, and it was either Castro, it might have been Che Guevara, one or the other, about what would happen if this turned to, a military affair in terms of actual military action. And now he's talking about, once we're trying to send these things in. So this is sort of, pre-October here. Khrushchev had said something to the effect of, well, I will send the Baltic Fleet in, to ensure that this happens. From a conventional standpoint, that I think is a kind of, for all of Khrushchev's concern about the emotional response of the Cubans, I don't think that ends up being a very realistic prospect for them at the end of the day. So weak was their position, conventionally, as I said, I'll just stick to that, in this part of the hemisphere. So, Khrushchev has some very, substantial military realities to deal with, that, whether you're one of the naysayers or not about the outcome of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, should something else have been, gained from it, or, what have you, he was in a much more difficult position, I think, than maybe is sort of popularly understood.
That's very interesting. That reminds me too, by the way, Will, Candy, it's a kind of related question. Candy submitted a question about McCone in particular, but among JFK and his advisors, thinking strategically politically in terms of political strategy in the Western Hemisphere. She asked if there was a chance that if we had undergone airstrikes in Cuba, would it have turned more Latin American countries against the United States? Do we have a sense of what other countries in the Western Hemisphere thought about either, Cuba, let's say, at first? What did they think about the Cuban Revolution? Were they inclined to sympathize more with a fellow Latin American country, or were they more at this time still anti-communist? Was there a real threat that if Cuba remained communist, would that spread through other Latin American countries? Or how aligned was Latin America with the United States? That's a lot of questions thrown into one, but
I'd look at the Organization of American States in part on that because, when they had a meeting of the Organization of American States, it's the Cuban delegation that walks out in the face of all this, and so that's kind of clear in terms of their estimation of what's been going on in Cuba at that point. I mean, for all the promises about land distribution among peasantry and all the rest of it, those kinds of things are not exactly coming to fruition, right? I mean, Castro does essentially an about face on those kinds of questions. 1 minute it's about land for everyone who hasn't had it, and then within the space of 2 years, from 59 to whatever, late 61 or early 62, why would we give all this land to these peasants? They're only going to become large scale landholders, or that's at least what their aspiration is going to be. So my sense is, and I'll defer to John on this, but my sense is, with respect to that organization, that that they supported how shall I say, a firm response to to Castro, to Cuba, and to this situation.
Yeah, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the regimes of other Latin American countries were terrified by what was going on in Cuba, because there was already talk at this point about exporting the revolution to other parts of Latin America. So if anything, these Latin American regimes were harder core than the United States was. They were, in fact, by and large, without the support of certain Latin American countries, the Bay of Pigs idea never would have even gotten off the ground.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. And that reminds me, too, by the way, of the importance of the OAS as an organization in not just in this particular circumstance, but even thinking historically afterwards. I find it interesting that even post Cuban Missile Crisis, we know there have been several attempts in Latin American countries at communist revolutions, and it's pretty rare that they've succeeded, interestingly enough. And so perhaps that has something to do with that, not just the importance of the creation of the OAS early on, but also the example of the communist revolution in Cuba, excuse me, that you're mentioning, John. So
now, Chris, sometimes it's suggested, if you look at the long term here, there's so many ways of looking at this, and I hope I'm not trying to jump to an end of anything, but just in terms of the outcome of all of this, that on one hand, that the presentation of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the Soviets blinked first, and it was kind of a huge singular victory for the Kennedy administration, and so on and so forth, and there's a debate and a discussion to be had over that in essence, because Khrushchev doesn't see it that way. He's I'm not going to say misquoted, but he's always partially quoted on this issue, because he doesn't see the Cuban Missile Crisis as some kind of utter failure for the Soviets and for the Cubans at the end of the day. As he said, we went in there to preserve Cuba from American imperialism, and Cuba was preserved from American imperialism. But on the flip side of that, with respect to these other states in their sort of post-Cuban Missile Crisis evaluation of things, if you look at Cuba economically in subsequent years, there's not a lot to hearten one about the success of this regime. I mean, the fact that their economy is completely beggared, their annual growth rate is negative. I think most years, if not virtually every year. Not a lot there to be favorably impressed by, if nothing else, if it doesn't come from an ideological standpoint, maybe just sort of a practical reality of life in Cuba.
Two things on this. One concerning Latin America, the other concerning Khrushchev. Latin American dictators had become very good at playing the United States by exaggerating the threat of subversion in their countries. And this, by the way, began in the 1930s with the threat of Nazi penetration, because they understood if they played up the threat, they got more aid from the United States. And then they certainly became good at that in the post-war period, except simply replacing Nazis with communists. The point about Khrushchev. Khrushchev had an interest in downplaying the magnitude of this for the Soviet Union. In fact, Khrushchev is going to try to minimize this and say, well, look what we got out of this deal. But it's Khrushchev's time as leader of the Soviet Union. His days are numbered at this point, and one of the big reasons for his removal is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in fact, I wouldn't want to say this is the only reason for the Sino-Soviet split. There are a whole slew of reasons behind that. The Cuban Missile Crisis is important because Mao is disgusted at the unwillingness of the Soviet Union to allow Castro to launch missiles and start the war. Castro himself was disappointed, but Mao played this up, and Mao actually tried to make a bid for leadership of the international communist movement out of all this. I mean, it failed utterly. Albania was the only communist state to side with China over this. Even Cuba said, we're going to thanks, but we're going to stick with the Russians. But this was regarded by a lot of the communist world as a defeat.
Yeah. I was going to say, John, pursuant to that, there was somebody you might be familiar with who it's one of those things. The quote is at least somewhat coming to mind. I don't remember precisely who said it, but it may have been Khrushchev to someone in either Castro or, as I said, it could have been Che Guevara. Someone who said, "I understand your willingness to die beautifully, but that's not the point. The point isn't to die. I mean, that's not." If we're so willing to go down, in a nuclear incinerator, that's not going to help this, sort of revolution in the big picture. That's not actually. I'm not after the Mao model on this. Of sort of millions for human fodder out there is not our picture.
Yeah. It's one wonders. Well, first of all, would Stalin have ever allowed? I don't know. Had Stalin been in charge rather than Khrushchev, would there have been a big difference in the outcome of this? As I said before, Stalin wasn't particularly interested in the third world, but certainly with the transition from Stalin to Khrushchev, you see the development of what would eventually be called the gerontocracy in the Soviet Union. Not young men who were fired by the romantic ideas of revolution, but elderly men who just liked power and wanted to hold on to it as long as they could. And yeah, starting World War III is not conducive to that goal.
That's a good point.
Nobody shirtless on horseback.
Yeah, right. Right. So since we're talking about sort of the effects or the consequences and after this event, I'm looking at two questions that were submitted earlier, and drawing from those a little bit. Shaylin had asked earlier about whether the Soviets gave up the high ground by trying to secretly smuggle in the missiles into Cuba, as opposed to the sort of openness with which the U.S. missiles had been placed in Turkey. But I'm wondering, building on that a little bit, John, you mentioned that the Soviets really lost face with China. What was the effect of Soviet prestige, if you will, in Europe, and in particularly among other Soviet bloc countries in Europe, or maybe countries leaning perhaps that way, like Yugoslavia or something like that? Do we know? Would you say that this hurt the put it another way, did this affect Soviet goals in Europe in the aftermath of this?
Yeah, I don't know that much about that. I mean, to say that Eastern European states had a choice, they say, oh, you know what, China, I'm going to go with China. They didn't. Albania was in a unique situation because it was a little more distant. A, it was a little more distant, and B, who the hell cared about Albania? It wasn't. It simply didn't matter. So Mao's challenge amounts to nothing in the end, but the very fact that he mounted it suggests that the Cuban Missile Crisis was pretty important.
Okay, good. But and sort of another similar kind of question, but pointed back to the effect of this on Cuba. John Hazlitt earlier was wondering about the effect of this on Castro's regime. Did this help Castro's regime, or was this really meaningless in a way to Castro's ability to maintain control in Cuba?
I don't know if you would disagree with me on this, Will, but it seems to me that there is nothing that Castro did differently in Cuba as a result of this. He was deeply disappointed. He thought that Khrushchev had caved on him, but in the end, Cuba understood how dependent Castro understood how dependent he was on the goodwill of the Soviet Union. I was just in Cuba in August, by the way, and just hearing people talk about what happened in Cuba and how the standards of living of Cuban people, which was never great to begin with, certainly under Castro, it plummeted after the end of the Cold War, because really it was massive aid from the Soviet Union and the willingness of the Soviets to buy from Cuba and sell to Cuba that really kept that country and kept that regime going.
That's I would
absolutely agree, and I would also just sort of add a little bit of an addendum here. With respect to Khrushchev's removal, within a space of 2 years, as John pointed out, clearly his performance in the Cuban Missile Crisis was, whether it was solely responsible or at least largely responsible, I think it would have kind of presumably have been part of a larger picture of how Khrushchev had been handling things, and therefore he was essentially, deposed, if you will, as a result of that. Must have given Castro at least a certain satisfaction if you think about how angry he was, and he was clearly incensed by the end result of this. And I don't mean to make it too how shall I say, simplistic, but there was a kind of business as usual mentality of it for Castro. I mean, he's still the maximum leader. He still has the regime intact. That hasn't changed. In the aftermath of all this, what he has, of course, is a guarantee from the administration that the United States is not going to, invade his country. Now, of course, you might, if you're Castro, you might, kind of look at that askance. Or, you're going to say anything's impossible? Well, probably not. But at the very least, you've managed to, or the Soviets have managed to extract that from the United States moving forward. That's a good thing from his point of view. And I'm sort of recalling Khrushchev's commentary in the kind of post-mortem on this whole business. That again, look, what were our objectives for all this about the Soviets blinking first and the great singular triumph, the show of strength by John F. Kennedy, and so on and so forth. We wanted Cuba to be free of American conniving and scheming and assassination attempts and intervention, and we've achieved that.
Those
I'm
are great points.
not trying to give them the last word, but that's certainly an important part, I think, of the picture there.
No, but what I take from that then, Will, is if there's a winner in this, it's Castro in a way, right? Because they don't. I mean, the Soviets don't get their ICBM delivery platform in Cuba, and there is that debate over who blinked and the face, the loss of face and things like this. But Castro's regime is secured, and if I understood John correctly, he continues to receive, I'm sure, some form of military aid. It may be small arms support and things like this, and some economic aid from the Soviet Union. That does continue after this, I believe, right? So
yeah, that isn't dried up per se.
Yeah.
The military aspect of it is not obviously the same, but yeah, I would. I'll throw this out real quick and just simply say, yeah, when I look at it in that sense, of course, I'm always tempted to say on one hand, look, if there's not a nuclear exchange, that's obviously a good thing. Right. People try to kind of game this all the time. What was the actual chance of a nuclear exchange? I believe it was Dean Acheson, if I'm not mistaken, who said, look, when I looked at this in the aftermath, even though President Kennedy, even in the midst of it, was saying he thought that there was a 1 in 3 chance of this going to combat and potential, nuclear exchange, he says, I look on it retrospectively, I'd say the chance is more like 1 in 100. So I don't, the sort of portrayal of, one side alone blinking, I have problems with by way of interpretation. And yeah, I think if you're going to look at it in terms of, who does best, probably I'm not going to say Cuba, I'm going to say Castro and Castro's, regime. Certainly if you're among those, the Cuban exiles or those who were sympathetic to the Cuban exiles, this is not for the benefit of Cuba. So I'm not going to call Cuba a winner in this. I had a conversation one time with one of those Cuban exiles, yeah, that's the last thing you would ever want to say to them.
Yeah, the Cuban people were not winners, but
right.
But in the grand picture of things, Castro, maintained and strengthened his regime.
Yeah, my gosh, I mean, look at the aftermath for him in terms of his regime, his ability to maintain power unchecked. It's rather remarkable.
And the United States did come out ahead in the sense, as you were saying, one, there's no nuclear war, and two, there is no ICBM platform established in Cuba. So those are pluses. John mentioned earlier the effect on Khrushchev and how that affected his leadership of the party. But even though there was this distance between the end of this and the removal of U.S. Nuclear missiles from Turkey, right, because of the distance, intentional distance, Willie pointed out, the Soviets could still point and say we did achieve that in a way, because my understanding is they linked those two things together. So trying to put a positive spin on things here to a certain extent. So the real losers, without a doubt, I think we all agree, were the Cuban people in this. But John, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of other outcomes. Both the United States and the Soviet Union are determined not to let things go so far. You see, for example, the development of the hotline to instantly connect the White House with the Kremlin, whereas in the past you'd had to go by telegrams, and eventually the test ban treaty. I think both of those things came direct. I mean, both had been talked about before, but the big impetus for these developments came from the sense that we came too close for comfort in this particular instance. And it's almost a kind of, I hesitate to use the word détente because, on the surface, the relations were just as bad as ever between the two countries. But you can't really point for the remainder of the 1960s to another major crisis directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, obviously, you've got ongoing fighting against communist forces, most notably in Southeast Asia, but nothing really comparable to the U.S. Soviet crises that had occurred in the late 40s and once in a while in like the U-2 crisis at the end of the Eisenhower administration, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, those are great points, John. And thanks for mentioning the test ban treaty. Thomas had asked about that earlier, and you just answered his question about the role that the Cuban Missile Crisis played in bringing that about. So Candy also just submitted a question. This is a tough one. Do we have a sense of what the Soviet people knew about what happened during those 13 days in October, or why Khrushchev was removed? Now, this is a tough question, as you both know, because public records are so secret and are still just sort of, to the extent that they remain, are still not entirely released. So if you know anything about what the Soviet people thought about this, I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. But I also want to know what the American public thought about this. What was public opinion in the United States like, especially during and perhaps immediately after this crisis? And if I can just add one more thing to that, John, you mentioned something I'm really fascinated with earlier, which is the sort of political situation in the United States with midterm elections coming up. What was the effect of this on politics in the United States?
Mm-hmm. It's fair to say that this would be regarded as JFK's signal achievement. This and his assassination are probably the sources of really all of his reputation. Because if you look at JFK's actual administration, he didn't accomplish much at all in terms of domestic politics. His foreign policy in general didn't bear a lot of fruit. I think so much of his reputation is built on the belief that he successfully handled this crisis. Because how did this look to the ordinary American? I've talked to my parents about this. My parents graduated from high school in the spring of 1962, so they very much remember the terror. I mean, people were really frightened by this crisis. And when it was resolved peacefully and apparently in favor of the United States, there was a tremendous sense of relief. And it carried over to the midterm elections. Now, traditionally, the party in power, the party that holds the White House, loses seats in a midterm election. And in fact, the Republicans did pick up 4 seats in the House, but the Democrats, in fact, won 4 seats in the Senate. So this was this suggests that the crisis rebounded to the benefit of the Democratic Party and to the administration.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I remember my parents also talked about this, and the sense in the 60s that nuclear annihilation, complete nuclear annihilation, could happen at any time, and how close we came, and that general sense of day-to-day or sort of fear of the possibility of these things, it did weigh heavily on the minds of Americans, and so when you don't end up with that, the sense of relief naturally is going to say, put you in a position to think, thanks Kennedy for not allowing that to happen. So that's a great point that you made.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to say, with respect to, with apologies to Candy here, I can't say much that would be anything other than speculation about Soviet public opinion.
Yeah.
But I would at least offer up just one thing, and that's that Khrushchev is in a much better position, obviously, to control the message or the lack thereof than is Kennedy in that respect. So I think when you look at the different political regime, the nature of the two governments, it certainly changes the dynamic depending upon which one you're in. I mean, not only as has been pointed out before, was Kennedy in a democracy, which presumably demanded certain things, but on top of that, he was from the Democratic Party, which demanded even some additional things, I think, in that particular context. But
that's a great point.
So I just speculative on my part that whether you want to call this assuming the worst or not, that the message that would have been out there for the Soviets was one of kind of the big V for victory. That it was that we had set out to do something and had in fact done it, even if we didn't leave the missiles in place. That the point was, did we get what we wanted? I mean, again, I know I've referenced John Lewis Gaddis, but I find his work on this pretty convincing in many respects. And that is that in the aftermath of this, that the Soviet position was, and certainly not with respect to China, as John rightly pointed out there, but that they were able to successfully portray things in the aftermath of all this, that their stature was enhanced ultimately presumably through at least their satellites at any rate, and maybe throughout much of the third world where they were trying to have influence, that no, the U.S., the imperialist, power was not able to topple this regime. We saw to that.
Yeah, that's a great point, because of course within the Soviet Union and in its sphere of satellite nations, the official party line is everything was a victory, right? So,
right.
So it's the effect outside of there that's interesting. Go ahead, John, please.
I was very interested in this question. I just now did a little bit of Googling on it, and from a site that appears to be reputable, suggests that that Pravda Izvestia provided almost no information about what was going on, simply that the Cuban people were being oppressed by the Americans. The Americans were trying to undo the revolution. American warmongers were making demands, and that the Soviet Union would stay firm behind its ally. It was so. My inclination is to say that the average Soviet citizen would have known almost nothing about what was going on.
Great point. Yeah, great point. By the way, we often do ask for book references, further reading from scholars that join us, and you both mentioned John Lewis Gaddis. Strategies of Containment is a great book. That may be what you're referencing. Are there other?
Chris, I was actually thinking of that, and also his later book that was the result of his initial look into the Soviet archives, and that's We Now Know.
Oh,
We Now Know.
I can recommend another one. It's called One Hell of a Gamble: Khrushchev, Castro, and Kennedy, 1958 to 1964, The Secret History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it is truly an international history that looks more or less equally at all sides of it. The authors are A.V. Fursenko, Fursenko, Alexander Fursenko, and Timothy Naftali, Naftali, who's an excellent diplomatic historian. But of course, anything Gaddis writes is good too.
Great. Thank you both. That's very useful. So we have a minute or two left, and I kind of hesitate to throw this question out there, but it's too tempting. A question submitted from, I believe it was Thomas. In the large scope of things, Thomas says, he's heard and read that the Cuban Missile Crisis is the most important moment in presidential history. Agree or disagree? I guess maybe he's wondering, how do we rank this crisis among other great crises? Is that fair? Is that a fair question, or is that even possible?
It's got to be up there. I don't know that I would. I don't know that it's as dire as what faced Lincoln in 1860, 1861. But I'd probably put it in the top 5.
Okay. Or FDR after Pearl Harbor? I don't know.
I don't know that. I don't know that Pearl Harbor was as. I would rank it ahead of Pearl Harbor, just in the sense that everyone understood what Pearl Harbor meant. We're going to go to war with Japan, and Pearl Harbor did not, in the end, significantly undermine the power of the United States to fight Japan. So it was pretty clear that although the attack was important and shocking, the United States was not in danger in a way that it was in 1962.
Great point.
or in 1861 for that matter.
Yeah, difficult to say. I absolutely agree with John in terms of the it's got to be way up there, I think, in any legitimate list, whether it's your top 5 or your top 3 or even your top 1. I think there might be a kind of apples and oranges in part going on here with Lincoln's crisis, with, the crisis of the Union. Is there going to be a Union or not? When leaving for the moment, what's going to happen if in fact there isn't, pursuant to the question of slavery and so on and so forth. I wouldn't want to rank this ahead of that, but on the other hand, this is of a different nature. That is to say, when we talk about leveling things, we really mean leveling things. I mean, if this goes the wrong way, it's really, it's the end of the Union, but in a very permanent sense there. So it's just very, very, kind of different scenarios there that I both think. I don't want to say this is 1 and this one is 2. I mean, if somebody's going to press me to it, I'm going to probably go with Lincoln and the crisis of union, because, as John says, that was much more real, I think, at the end of the day, in terms of a reality. There is a civil war, there is secession, there is a civil war, there is a war on for the life of the Union, and the sort of flip side in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, this is a little bit like a crapshoot at the end of the day, because who knows that, what you can say about the odds of there being a nuclear exchange, but retrospectively it seems less than what might have been most people's sense, at the time.
Great points, both, and so thoughtful. We would expect nothing less from both of you on these things. So this has been a great webinar, great discussion, fantastic insights from both of you, and I thank you both very much for your time and your expertise on these things. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime in the future.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Great day, guys. Thank you.
You too.
Thanks to everybody joining us. Thanks for some great questions. Look for an email from us. I forgot to mention this earlier. In the next week, that will have a link by which you can both access the archived video and audio from today's discussion, and a link that you can request a certificate, by which you can request a certificate of participation for this webinar. So look for that email in the next week. Our next Saturday webinar will be March 3rd. It's a Saturday, of course, and the topic, the crisis, is Bloody Sunday in Selma. So I hope to see you all then, and until then, take care, and thanks.